Cognition, An Introduction to Cognitive Science by Benjamin Miss. Introduction and Methods, Part 1. In this chapter, you will learn about the history of cognitive science and its place in psychology, as well as modern methods of scientific inquiry. What is cognitive science? How does the mind work? What is the structure of the mind? Cognition refers to thinking, which is a process of the mind produced by the brain. There are active and passive thoughts, what the great American psychologist William James referred to as substantive thought and transitive thought. We spend most of our time in transitive thought, which is like the stream of consciousness, the wandering mind that responds automatically. Substantive thought is focused and effortful. If you are reading and you forget the sentence you just read, your mind wandered away from substantive thought into transitive thought. James spent a great deal of time thinking about thinking and influenced the psychological philosophy of functionalism, which focused on the overall function of the mind. The quote, "A great many people think they are thinking when they are merely rearranging their prejudices," is often attributed to William James, though the true attribution of the quote is unknown. It is, however, likely that James would have nodded in agreement had he heard it spoken, because it fits with his philosophy. The term prejudices used here doesn't necessarily mean prejudices like racial or gender. Instead, it refers to any beliefs you already have that you continue to think about. It doesn't take any effort of thought to bring to mind things you already believe. It does take effort to consider your beliefs and consider new evidence that may be contradictory. We know from many studies in psychology that people do not like to think they are wrong. What is the difference between psychology and cognitive science? Psychology has become an incredibly broad field, which includes cognitive science. While psychology is generally considered to be the study of mind and behavior, it includes the study of the brain and the treatment of mental illness. Cognitive science is specifically concerned with the structure of the mind. How this specific focus came about is due to the history of psychology in the 20th century. What did psychology look like in the first half of the 20th century? Sigmund Freud's psychoanalytic therapeutic focus and many other modes of popular therapy continued to be applied in treating patients. From an academic scientific perspective, it was the behaviorists that dominated research. The behaviorists, like B.F. Skinner, were focused only on behavior and how behavior is influenced through reinforcement and punishment. An important note on operant conditioning is at the end of this chapter. It might help to review it now. In addition to the behaviorists, social psychology gained popularity in the post-World War II period, but social psychology also heavily relied on experiments that observed behavior. In the late 1950s, Skinner wrote a book called Verbal Behavior. This book was a description of language learning from a behaviorist perspective. This meant that Skinner described language learning entirely in relation to operant conditioning. An example of this is when a patient wants to reinforce a child's use of speech. So when the child says cookie, the parent gives the child a cookie. The linguist Noam Chomsky read the book and wrote a dense, analytical review that spanned over 30 pages. In this review, Chomsky outlined examples where Skinner's theories failed from a linguistic perspective, but also gave examples where language is learned without reinforcement. Novelty is attractive to humans, and in many ways, children learn simply by exploring the world. Jean Piaget, the Swiss developmental psychologist, described the infant as a young scientist. Chomsky also begins to argue for innate language abilities, which he would later expand and will be discussed in the chapter Linguistic Cognition section of this text. In the end, behaviorism fell out of favor largely due to Chomsky opening an entirely new avenue of research and the inability of the behaviorists to respond to his criticisms. It is unfortunate, however, because in his critique, Chomsky wrote, "Reinforcement undoubtedly plays a significant role, but so do a variety of motivational factors. about which nothing serious is known in the case of human beings. Chomsky was not rejecting the science of behaviorism, yet he changed the direction of the pendulum back to the study of the structure of the mind, and advancements in neuroscience and experimental methodology did the rest. Modern cognitive science grew out of these philosophies of mind, including William James's functionalism, Gestalt psychology, anatomical studies, Noam Chomsky's nativism, and other ideas from other thinkers. It is an investigation of the mind using experimentation and methods of modern neuroscience. Yet, unlike neuroscientists, we are less interested in the function of the brain than in the function of the mind. Whatever the mind is, it is what produces our sense of self and consciousness and causes us to wonder about the meaning of life. This is the area of cognitive science. Cognitive scientists will study neuroscience, social psychology, and other areas, but our concern is directly related to the mind. Philosophy of mind. Modern psychology is linked with philosophy of mind. Early psychologists like Wilhelm Wundt and William James were both deeply interested in consciousness, and their studies of the mind were an attempt to understand what David Chalmers calls the hard problem of consciousness. The hard problem of consciousness addresses the question of why we have subjective conscious experiences, which philosophers of mind called qualia. Why do we feel our sense of self? Why do we have anything inside our minds at all? Chalmers describes the philosopher's zombie, or P-zombie, to help us understand this concept. The P-zombie is exactly like us, but has no internal life. There is nothing it is like to be a P-zombie. They do not have metaconsciousness, or an awareness of their own consciousness. We will attempt to address this metaconscious rather than consciousness, because many psychologists define consciousness as being conscious of or aware of something, which sounds a lot like the term attention. We can see that many other species experience some degree of awareness of the world around them. What makes us special is this metaconsciousness, which is our being aware of being aware. We do have these internal special experiences, which we believe separates the human mind from the mind of an animal. Being human is a unique experience. Since we are not P-zombies, one of the great questions of philosophy is why we are not P-zombies. We can imagine a P-zombie would be just as successful at survival and reproduction as a typical human, without the angst and existential crises. A P-zombie would never lie awake, wondering what is the meaning of life. They have no internal qualia. The question is best left to the philosophers, and modern cognitive science and neuroscience are better tasked with answering the easy problem of consciousness rather than the hard problem. The easy problem seeks to understand what your brain is doing when you are having an experience. Methods for investigating the easy problem involve ways of looking at the internal function of a living brain, and we are far closer to understanding the easy problem, what, than the hard problem, why. The broad terms rationalism and empiricism are ancient debates about ways of knowing the world, and allow us to trace the study of the mind back thousands of years, though in modern terms they relate to the nature versus nurture debate. These ways of thinking have been debated for centuries, and both have their place. Rationalism refers to the idea that we can know things without being taught, and we deduce things about the world by thinking about them, similar to Chomsky's idea of innate abilities. Empiricism suggests that the only way we can learn is through observing the world, similar to Skinner's theories of conditioning. As with many scientific debates, understanding the world requires us to consider both innate human abilities and learning. Philosophy of mind traditionally deals with what are called thought experiments. For instance, the great thinker, the Muslim thinker Avicenna, would be considered a rationalist. He wrote during the golden age of Islamic thought, at the turn of the first millennia, and describes the floating man thought experiment to argue for the existence of the soul, which sounds more like the modern conception of the mind. In fact, reading through history, the qualities often discussed as the difference between the body and the soul are similar to our modern discussion of the differences between brain and mind. Avicenna suggested that if God created a person out of thin air, floating in space, the person would still know himself even without the benefit of sense experience. Thought experiments can be the beginning of empirical science, but by modern standards they are often flawed. Avicenna had no way of knowing what a person would experience in a sensory deprivation tank, or that the body has proprioceptors that send sense information about the body to the brain even without gravity. The modern scientific method did not develop until the late 19th century. Modern philosophers who study philosophy of mind consistently use evidence from cognitive science studies to support their beliefs. For instance, there are two main ways of viewing the link between mind and brain. You can assume that the mind and brain are fundamentally one thing, which is called monism. Or you can believe that the mind and brain are two different things, and that belief is called dualism. Starting with dualism, if you were to ask most students what they believe, they would support dualism. This links with many great thinkers and religious beliefs that see the soul, mind, or consciousness as separate from the body. The big problem with dualism is that it assumes there are two separate substances in the universe, with the physical world being separate from, but interacting with, the world of conscious entities or minds. When people reflect on these dualistic beliefs, they are less likely to adhere to them. Paul Bloom, who studies infant perception, argues that we perceive the world of objects as essentially separate from the world of minds, making it possible for us to envision soulless bodies and bodiless souls. In other words, since our consciousness appears to be separate from the meat of the brain, we look for and create a supernatural explanation for the existence of the mind, which is not reliant on the body. Monism comes from two main types, physicalism and idealism. There is a third, less accepted type that assumes both matter and mind are produced by another substance. Physicalism, also called materialism, is the belief that only the physical world exists, and that the mental world and consciousness are illusions. Idealism is the belief that the only thing that exists in the world is the world of consciousness, and that the physical world is the illusion. To summarize these ideas, either only the physical world is real, only the mental world is real, or they are both real and interact even though we cannot explain how they interact or measure the mental as separate from the physical. I have perhaps oversimplified these arguments. The important point is that the key to the very nature of the world and our place in it may well be the study of the mind. One way of thinking about modern cognitive science is philosophy of mind plus the scientific method. In the next video, we will go through part 2 of the introduction and methods. Thank you.